Hello, I'm Selina Downes and welcome to Inside America, the show that brings you insight and analysis of the biggest issues facing the United States right now. In today's episode, is political violence threatening to derail democracy in America? US President Donald Trump has faced a third assassination attempt, and just days ago, a gunman was shot on the National Mall as violent rhetoric is blamed for stoking tensions. I speak with former Secret Service agent Michael Matranga about this threat environment and ask whether it's getting harder to predict, prevent, and contain.
We are at what I say is a critical boiling point here in the United States, where rhetoric, there is no more boundaries. There's no more moral, ethical compass that's kind of keeping us in line.
But first, social media algorithms are being blamed for amplifying extreme voices on the right and the left and fueling the kind of lone wolf attacks we've seen on the president and other officials. It's proving a challenge for the authorities to track and trace the perpetrators of these types of crimes, and much harder to prevent. The White House was once again on high alert. Less than 2 weeks after the president was targeted at a dinner in Washington, his security team shot a gunman on the National Mall. They say he'd expressed hostility towards the administration. America is no stranger to political violence, but politically motivated attacks are now at a 30-year high, driven by deep polarization and declining trust in US institutions. President Donald Trump faced his third assassination attempt at a recent dinner in Washington, when a suspect armed with a shotgun, a handgun and knives rushed a security checkpoint.
Secret Service came running up. They immediately pulled the President and First Lady and Carolyn Leavitt, who were on the dais. They pulled them to safety.
The gunman sent a 1,000-word manifesto to his family minutes before the attack, calling himself a friendly federal assassin.
She says,
Former FBI Special Agent Mike Harrigan says it raises questions and concerns about security at a time of heightened tensions.
Yeah, that was a shocking attack. It really came out of nowhere, and the way it was done was very unusual in the fact that someone was prepared. They were able to stay in the actual venue with the hotel there, and the way they rushed the checkpoint, they didn't get through the perimeter, but yeah, it was a very unusual circumstance, and one that's caused a lot of discussion and a lot of, consternation among the public, that if he can be there in a secure area and still be attacked, someone could just show up. So people want to know why.
And consternation in the public, but also was there consternation within the security services as well, do you think?
Absolutely. I think one of the big things with these type of attacks and the way the Secret Service works is whenever an attack happens, they have to reassess their procedures and processes. They have to reassess how they collect intelligence, how they identify developing threats.
They said, take a look at what happened.
It's not just the president under fire. Violence has engulfed the nation's entire political system at all levels of government. In the past year, the conservative activist Charlie Kirk was assassinated at a university event in Utah. His wife Erica was at the function in Washington when President Trump was targeted.
I just want to go find
In other attacks, 2 Minnesota lawmakers have been shot in their homes. The Pennsylvania governor's mansion was set on fire while he and his family slept inside. And 2 National Guard soldiers were shot near the White House. Polls show roughly 1 in 5 Americans, that's tens of millions of people, believe violence is justified for a political cause. A sentiment highest among young adults. Some lawmakers say it is changing the way they vote on critical issues. Chris Jackson has spent years researching public opinion in the US and says a mix of economic and societal pressures are driving people to lash out against the government.
I think that is one of those big long-term trends we've seen since the 1970s, really. Americans have lost trust in most of the institutions of society the executive branch, the legislative branch, the media. And what we're seeing in the United States right now is this pressure cooker environment where tensions, fear, anxiety, anger keeps getting ratcheted up across a bunch of different levels, economic pressures, and then also the pressures people are getting from social media, from sort of the information environment where they're seeing more loud and angry discourse, and that's sort of making them think that's normal.
The White House blames the president's political opponents for fueling the problem.
This hateful and constant and violent rhetoric directed at President Trump day after day after day for 11 years has helped to legitimize this violence and bring us to this dark moment.
But critics accuse the president of normalizing political violence in his own social media posts and memes, using terms like human garbage to describe his rivals and saying he's glad when they die. Experts say the social media landscape in the US amplifies and rewards extreme voices on both sides of the political spectrum.
Social media incentivizes being loud, being outrageous. That's how you get attention. As long as that's how the system works, you're never really going to see the volume come down. It's fundamentally built into the way the system works. Being moderate, it's like, well, let's get along and have a good debate. No one wants to watch that. That's when you have 1,000 different channels of content to watch, you stop on the thing that captures your attention. You don't stop on the thing that seems kind of boring.
Deciphering what is online rhetoric or a serious intent to harm is one of the biggest challenges for law enforcement in the US.
The problem with social media, while it's part of society and it's an important way we communicate our relationships and everything else, how we do business, the issue is the algorithms there. The algorithms that are meant for marketing purposes to feed us products that we're interested in, different types, to sell us stuff. And the same thing with ideas and media and other individuals, blogs and all types of communications. When somebody shows an interest in one type of philosophy, it tends that the algorithms will feed them more of those of the same reinforcing philosophy. And the problem we have is with individuals, they see that, and a person who's not well balanced will then take that crush and concentration of extreme information, and to them, they seem as the world is closing in on them, that there's an existential threat to society or whatever by this one person or philosophy, and it causes some people, some weak-minded people that may be mentally struggling, to then react and act out violently.
The US has experienced periods of political violence throughout its history. 4 sitting presidents have been assassinated, from Abraham Lincoln to JFK, along with civil rights leaders Martin Luther King and Malcolm X.
Into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood.
How the US navigates this period of its history remains to be seen. But as the country prepares to celebrate 250 years of independence, most people agree political violence is a threat, not just to the politicians, but the political institutions on which American democracy was built. So with a summer of high-profile public events planned here in the United States, can the security services keep up with rising threat levels? I spoke to former Secret Service agent Michael Matranga, who protected Barack Obama throughout his presidency. I asked him about the latest assassination attempt on Donald Trump and what security failings stood out to him.
Let's take what we know as public information, and I'm not sharing anything that's classified. But even beyond that checkpoint, you still had additional armed assets before you breach the door. Then let's say once he does breach the door, or once an armed force breaches the door, you have multiple counter surveillance units inside of that ballroom who are plainclothes. You have the FBI's protective detail with Kash Patel. You have RFK's protective detail with the U.S. Marshals. You have the president and the vice president's protective details. And then secondarily to all of those, you have the 2 tactical teams that are designed to protect and defend the president and the vice president. That's an additional 6-man team each.
But this was a suspect who had very little tactical training. He said himself that he thought that the level of security was incompetent. He said it was insane. There was no security in the hotel. They didn't anticipate that someone could have checked in the day before, that he was able to get close enough and to at least breach one of the security checkpoints.
Well, I think that when he made those statements, that was at least 24 hours prior to the event occurring. So obviously the level of security while the president, the vice president, and the cabinet members were on scene were going to be different than 20 hours prior or 24 hours prior. So
was it a security failing that there were so many cabinet members in the room at once?
I wouldn't say it was a security failure. I would say that there definitely needs to be a policy review to see if that is a requirement or if that is necessary moving forward. Usually when we see that many cabinet members in one place, those are for designated national special security events like the State of the Union. I do recommend that the administration and the Secret Service have a conversation further of whether that is appropriate moving forward.
He did say that he was also able to transport the weapons that he carried across the country. Presumably, we know he took a train from the West Coast to the East Coast. He was able to get in and check into the hotel. He said in his manifesto he apologized to everybody that he'd come in contact with those weapons that he may have put at risk.
The Second Amendment of the United States Constitution allows Americans without a criminal history to possess and own firearms. I think this goes to the level of planning and premeditation, which is not going to favor for him in a prosecution's perspective, is that, he specifically took train because he knows that there are not as many security protocols in place as if he were to travel by air. It's not that hard. I mean, I live in Texas. I'm a Second Amendment advocate. I've professionally handled weapons and carried weapons for a very long time. I have two sitting right here in my presence. If I wanted to carry a weapon from Texas to, Florida, I could do that without any, there's no laws being broken. He didn't break any laws transporting those weapons. Now, where he broke laws was with the intentions of carrying out an attack.
So is the prevalence of guns in the United States not a huge challenge for not just the Secret Service, but also for law enforcement? You have a population of 340 million people, estimates of 500 million guns in the hands of civilians. Is that not a challenge for law enforcement when you're trying to prevent these kinds of attacks?
It absolutely is a challenge. The Second Amendment of the United States, again, guarantees the right to individuals that are citizens here to own and possess weapons.
But there is no official national registry, so you don't know whose hands those weapons are in.
Correct. There is no official registry, national registry. Correct.
And so is it challenging when we see these kinds of lone wolf attacks?
Sure, of course. Anytime you have 500 million weapons within the citizenry, there's always a challenge in trying to control those weapons. But again, it boils down to it's the constitutional right of Americans to own and possess those weapons. And so, we have things in place that would prevent individuals from being able to purchase legally those weapons, but that does not prevent them from maintaining or possessing those weapons or acquiring those weapons illegally.
So when you're looking at attacks like this or trying to prevent them, what critical red flags might there be?
With today's digital age, I believe that we could initially start focusing heavily on identifying these individuals through technical means. But also encouraging, friends, family, relatives, coworkers to be a little more self-conscious when they're dealing with individuals who may have grievances that are consuming them.
You mentioned the sort of social media angle, and also we talked about the prevalence of guns. They kind of collided in a social media post by the president himself recently, where he appeared with an assault rifle with the headline, "No more Mr. Nice Guy." It was directed at Iran. But is that kind of political rhetoric normalizing violence?
I do believe that this type of rhetoric is normalizing violent behavior. Social media has amplified that. And, I don't know how we put this, for lack of better words, I don't know how we put this genie back in the bottle to where there's a standard of, a baseline, I guess I should say, of moral and ethical boundaries in which we don't cross anymore. Being there when the United States elected the first African American president in history, uh, being able to watch that campaign grow from its infancy to becoming what it was, and that was a truly transformational and pivotal moment in politics in the United States. It was one of the greatest honors of my life. And so, with that came certain security, hurdles. Having, elected the first African American president that we overcame. But if even back then in 2007 and 2008, the political rhetoric was not where it is at the moment.
We've got a big summer ahead in the United States. We've got obviously a lot of events planned this summer. There is World Cup soccer. There are the 250th year birthday celebrations of the United States. There are the midterm elections later this year. How challenging are these events to the security services, to law enforcement, to provide security for these events but not detract from the events themselves?
I think with these large scale events, it's going to cause significant hurdles for security services from local, state, and federal agencies, even at the national level from a military perspective on how they secure these sites. What I say is a critical boiling point here in the United States, where rhetoric, there is no more boundaries. There's no more moral, ethical compass that's kind of keeping us in line. And so in my opinion, it increases the risk to law enforcement and security services.
So, is what we're seeing in the US right now familiar? Is political violence baked into America's history? And if so, what does the future hold? Joining me to discuss this is political historian and professor at George Washington University, Matthew Dallek, and national security analyst and author Eric Ham. Welcome to you both. What is driving political violence in America right now? And is it different to other periods in US history, or do we see some parallels?
I think violence is actually baked into the United States DNA. The United States, even though we don't want to admit it, is inherently a violent country. We were birthed out of violence. The country grew and accelerated out of violence. We had the genocide of Native Americans. We know about America's history along the color lines in terms of African Americans. So what we're seeing play out right now is actually cyclical. It's not necessarily something that went away, because this is who the United States is. This is, I think, who the United States will continue to be.
I agree that the United States is especially violent if you compare it to major industrial democracies. I mean, think about this. More than, or at least 1/4 of all presidents or president-elects have been either killed or shot or subject to a major assassination attempt. And if we think about the 1960s and 70s, which I think is the last era when it was really flowing, the Vietnam War played a major role. So the war kind of comes home in a way. We're seeing that, I think, maybe to some extent in the United States, where foreign military interventions produce more violence at home.
Right, the 1960s obviously was a highly period of a lot of political violence, the assassinations of Malcolm X, of Martin Luther King, of JFK. Eric, how do you see that being different or similar to what we're seeing play out now?
Well, you were speaking about wars, and if we look at right now at this moment in time, the United States is celebrating its 250th anniversary. And so this is a time of great celebration. We saw King Charles was in town just a week ago, kicking off that celebration. But if we look at the United States, still a very, very young country compared to so many others, but it's a nation that is actually, throughout its history, has seen 80% of its existence engaged in warfare. And that's just global conflict that we're talking about, not just the conflict internally. And so what we saw in 1960, and in terms of what we're seeing today, this has been something that we have been seeing playing out for many, many years. So I think there's always just danger, violence lurking just around the corner, because, again, I think our politics breeds that level of violence, unfortunately.
How How much do you think that the language that is being used by elected officials and the president himself is playing into this? How much does language matter in normalizing or minimizing violence?
I mean, I think there's no question that the president has fueled this violence, and he's also been a victim of it, but he has been an accelerant. So it's rhetoric, but it's also actions. You know, what kind of message does it send if you talk about individuals poisoning the blood of the country, or people are scumbags, they're vermin, you know, they're the lowest forms of life.
Which is leveled against Haitians and Somalis and
Yeah, so it's, you know, the line, I think, between extremist rhetoric and political violence it has faded.
Equally, the Democrats accuse President Trump of being a fascist and evil and likening him to Hitler. And we see that when we see King's protests that take part in cities all across the country. In that it is coming from both sides.
So there is some evidence that over the past year or two, we've seen more acts of political violence coming from the left, whereas the prior 10 to 20 years or more, it was more coming from the right.
Actually, I want to push back because I don't think that we are seeing a rise in violence from the left. If you even look at Luigi Mangione, who actually shot and killed a healthcare executive, you look at this young man who shot up at the White House Correspondents Center. I think what we're seeing here are two young people who are certainly polarized, but I think are reacting to a political environment that has rendered them helpless to be able to actually have impact or agency in their own lives. And so I think what you're seeing are people who are responding to that. And I think that is a failure of our public policy, and more importantly, of our leaders who are meant to actually serve and help the people, particularly those that are most vulnerable.
How much does social media play into all of this, do you think?
I mean, I think most people who study this agree social media is in the mix, right? It's a factor. The question is how much does it contribute?
Right, because it wasn't available in the 1960s.
Exactly. And arguably the 1960s and early 70s was a more violent time. I mean, you know, you saw massive resistance to civil rights, which was incredibly violent. But social media clearly acts as a force for radicalization. It's easier, and you can spread ideas with greater speed. You can spread dehumanizing rhetoric more quickly. Individuals who are willing to commit acts of violence can, you know, go online, as the person who killed Charlie Kirk, or was alleged to kill Charlie Kirk, apparently did. Spent a lot of time on gaming and, you know, social media. So I think it has created an atmosphere that makes political violence more likely, makes Americans feel more balkanized, right, more isolated, and so I think it's a structural problem. But I don't think it's a tool. I don't know that it's a root cause, because we've seen so many other eras of political violence.
You're nodding, Eric.
Yeah, exactly. Because again, and oftentimes I think it's very easy, but also intellectually lazy, to always place the blame squarely at the feet of President Donald Trump, particularly when you look at the history of the United States and how violent the United States has been. And particularly when you go back to January 6th, and the fact that many believe, even members of Donald Trump's own party believe, that he was the single biggest instigator in that level of violence that took place.
7 Republicans, I think it was, wasn't it, that voted to convict him, although he was acquitted of inciting violence.
But the fact that the nation then turned around and elected him a second time in office, I think that speaks more to a reflection of, again, the DNA and the people of this country itself, and not necessarily Donald Trump. Donald Trump is simply a microcosm of who and what the nation is. And I think it's more incumbent upon those who are electing, those who are empowering people, to actually be more honest about who they are, and more importantly, what they want, and the level of violence that they're willing to live with and accept to actually achieve their own political aims.
But I think a lot of people voted for him because they wanted lower prices. and they wanted the border to be closed. This is not to justify one way or another how people do or don't vote, but it is to say that, you know, there are some people who voted for Trump who don't like his rhetoric, who, you know, wish that he would, you know, get off Truth Social or Twitter. So, you know, people have different motivations, I think. But yes, I mean, the country, I would say, look, I mean, you do have a president, last point I'll make here, is that you do have a president who attends UFC fights, these really brutal spectacles of, you know, men who are beating each other, like very badly. And he's attending it, top leaders are attending it. You know, what kind of signal does that send? It's a reflection, I think, of culture of violence that is at least part of the United States. It's part of our past. It does ebb and flow, and I think it is flowing right now.
This is who and what the nation is. And so when these things happen, it should not be surprising or shocking that the country elected a convicted felon. Because again, I think this is who and what America is. We want someone like Donald Trump to represent us because he is us.
Okay, we have to leave it there. Great discussion. Thanks to you both. I want to thank my panel of guests, Matt Dallek and Eric Ham. Thank you for joining me on this very wet and windy rooftop here in Washington. That is it for this week's show. Thanks for watching.